Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome welcome to kind of a strange Monday here as again, as you probably saw in my team's message in my email, having a bit of a heat wave here in Vancouver, so it's quite a bit warmer than it normally is by almost 20 degrees. So we've decided to allow people to either stay home or to come into the college to do class. And so here, as you might notice, I'm at home because I'm about an hour away from the college normally, so I thought it might be just easier to stay home and do this. But of course, for online people, there won't be much of a difference for you, but maybe there will be for students who are normally in class. So if you're a student who's normally in class, can you just sign in the live chat? I guess that's below, just so I kind of know you're here, and I'll ask you to maybe try and use that live chat to answer questions or to ask them as well. So you've kind of seen how that works in class anyway, so maybe I'll just encourage you to do that, okay? So first off, Sean's here. Good morning, Sean. Simran is here. Good morning, Simran. Reza's here. Good morning, Reza. Basil's here. Good morning, Basil. Hassan is here. Good morning, Hassan. Ben is here. Good morning, Ben. A bunch of people are showing up too. Ben's here. Good morning, Ben. Jesse's here. Good morning, Jesse. Malika's here. Good morning, Malika. Oasis is here. Good morning to you, sir. I guess good evening, probably. Hamad is here. Good morning, Hamad. Ben is checking in. Awesome. Okay. So hopefully we'll be joined shortly by more people. I think we've got maybe half of our people here. But we'll just dive in and get started, okay? So if I recall from, actually before I start going here, can somebody just let me know in the live chat here, I've got a fan just off camera and it's pointing at my face. So is it too loud? Or can you hear me clearly? Can you just maybe let me know? That would be helpful. Okay, so if I recall on Friday we were coming out of that discussion on women's suffrage, right? So we watched a little video and we talked about the idea of women gaining the right to vote. And so, Oasis, we can hear you. Okay, that's good. Thank you, Oasis. Yeah, we were talking about women's suffrage and how women were able to gain the right to vote, but also what kind of barriers were standing in their way, right? And so I wanted to sort of take this opportunity to talk about these 4 key elements of oppression that we talked about a little bit earlier. The idea that oppression was historical and ideological and institutional and cultural, okay? And so one of the things that we said about oppression being historical is that oppressions have a historical component to them, right? So not only do certain groups have power for long periods of time, but because they do, they're able to kind of create society, or structure society, or in this case, structure government in a way that benefits them. So, the example I gave you here is that, in most countries, we have governments that are dominated by men, but even if we were to, here in Canada, for instance, even if we were to have an election tomorrow and elect entirely women to the government, there would be, that wouldn't really solve all the problems, right? Because governmental systems and government policies have all been created kind of by men for men. And so, because of that, we wouldn't have an entirely non-sexist government. And so the women we elected would have to kind of work hard to change some policies and change how the government works to make it more equitable. But that would take some time and some effort. Right? So oppression has a historical component to it. We also said that, and Nicole is here. Good morning, Nicole. Oppression has an ideological component, right? So we said ideologies were big shared ideas that society believes in and are kind of reinforced in a number of different ways, okay? So these aren't kind of little things, these aren't little beliefs or sort of simple kinds of ideas. they're the big ones, right? The big ones that underlie a lot of the way society works. Right? And so, in terms of looking at women's suffrage, one of the ideologies is sorry, what am I trying to say here? It's a little bit early, and it's a little bit of a it's a weird one, isn't it? Ideology kind of sets up the world so that in the way that we expect it to be. That doesn't make any sense. Sorry, let me try again. Ideologies describe how the world works. Okay, and so again, we have maybe underlying the idea of women's suffrage, we have an idea of meritocracy, right? So we said meritocracy was the idea that you can, if you work hard enough, you will be successful. And people who aren't successful just aren't working hard enough, right? And so if you apply that to women's suffrage, well, why are there no women in government? Well, maybe they're not, capable of participating in that arena, right? Maybe they're not logical enough, right? Or maybe they're too emotional. And so we take the stereotypes and then we sort of apply them to this ideology, right? And so, but in doing so, that's kind of a circular logic thing. Basil says he's having a hard time hearing me. Okay, give me 1 second here, Basil. Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second. Okay. So, Basil, can you tell me, is that better or is that worse? I'll keep talking just to give you a baseline on my voice. Better? Worse? Same? Oh, that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate because now I turned the fan off and it's oh god. Okay. Okay. That's unfortunate. Okay. I'll tough it out. So the idea here is that one of the ideologies underlying at least Western society is meritocracy, right? The idea that if you work hard, you will succeed, and therefore, if there aren't women in government, that's the result of their individual actions, right? There's either they're not capable, or they don't work hard enough, or there's some sort of explanation for why they're not there, right? And so again, maybe it doesn't work perfectly for women's suffrage, but ideologies do have an impact on oppression, right? And so if I can do a little tangent here, meritocracy does help us to explain classism, right? It does help us to explain economic inequalities in society, right? So, society might want us to believe that, people who are rich and powerful and successful indeed have, gotten there because they've worked the hardest, right? And again, sometimes there's truth to that, and sometimes there isn't, right? And so, but either way, the idea of meritocracy backs up that inequality, right? It backs up that oppression. Okay, so these kind of ideologies kind of allow us to rationalize inequality as normal. Good morning, Andre. They help us rationalize those things as normal, okay? And so, the fact that there were no women in government prior to, let's say, 1920 here in Canada, that didn't surprise anyone because everyone had the belief that women didn't belong there, that politics was kind of a men's world. They believed that women weren't rational enough or logical enough, and so they didn't really question the inequality when they saw it, right? They thought it was normal. They thought it was easily explained by psychology or by the Bible, or just by things that they quote unquote knew, and so they didn't really, they weren't really shocked by it. The same thing with, if we go back to Mean Girls, why the plastics and the jocks, we started watching that movie, and we saw that, the plastics were, I think Damien explained to us that the plastics were high school royalty, right? And Regina was the queen bee. And that kind of idea wasn't confusing to us, right? Because we've kind of accepted the idea that people who are wealthy and good looking and fashionable, they are kind of looked up to, right? We give them power and status and respect in society. Now, the question about whether we should is another question, but we often do give them that power, right? Because again, at least in the West here, society values good looks and fashion and money, right? And so when we started watching that movie, we didn't really question why the plastics were on top, right? If it was, I don't know, the band geeks, if the band geeks were the most powerful group in the school, that would confuse us, right? We would see that in the film and we'd think, oh, what's up with that, right? Because again, that doesn't reflect kind of the ideologies and the sort of stereotypes that we've already absorbed. And so when we see the plastics at the top of the social hierarchy, we don't question it, right? We think, yeah, that's the way it is. And none of the kids in the school really questioned it either, right? Because they knew how it was supposed to be. Good morning, Rafay. Nice to see you. So again, when we believe that the social hierarchy is natural, it's difficult to see inequality, right? When we see it just as a result of how people are, it's difficult to identify inequality, right? Yeah, okay, I've said enough about that. Oppression is institutional. We talked about this, the idea that society has a lot of social institutions in it. Those social institutions kind of work to do things that society needs them to do. Societies need governments to kind of control things. They need education to teach younger society members. They need families to kind of support and raise children. They need a criminal justice system to punish the bad people, right? So societies have institutions that all have a function, and they do those functions, right? They perform those functions for society, but they also reproduce society as it is. And so here with the women's suffrage example, women didn't control any of those social institutions, and therefore they weren't able to use the power of those institutions to make change for themselves, but also those institutions were pressing back against them, right? And so here we have doctors claiming that, women are not, they're too frail, they're too weak to engage in politics. Psychiatrists are saying that women don't have the kind of temperament to participate in politics. Religion was telling women that no, their place was in the home, obeying their husbands. Journalists were speaking out, so the media was speaking out against it. The criminal justice system was kind of punishing women who broke the laws and protested and things like that. So again, if who's ever able to control society's institutions will be able to kind of enforce their prejudices on society. They'll be able to sort of make society in a way that's advantageous for them, right? And here you can see women can't use those institutions to help themselves, but also those institutions are kind of holding them back, right? Getting in the way of them gaining the right to vote. Finally, oppressionist culture. Sorry, I didn't mean to take this long to go through this, but it's early Monday morning and it's hard to get organized and going, right? The last thing is oppression is cultural, right? So I've showed you this diagram a bunch of times, and a lot of our ideas about how our world works are, well, all of our ideas are cultural, right? In terms of gender roles, in terms of what kind of things deserve respect and power, ideas about sexuality, ideas about race, right? Ideas about us and them, right? Who's us in whatever country we live in, who's us and who's them, who's the outsider. all those ideas are kind of wrapped up in culture, right? And again, the deeper that those ideas are, the deeper in the iceberg, the more, the more people will have an emotional reaction to them, right? And so, I'm just kind of looking on this. I'm just looking at this diagram again, and yeah, it's interesting. I was just kind of thinking. I was trying to compare something like economic inequality to maybe gender inequality, right? So, or economic norms to gender norms. So if you had someone violating in your society, violating gender norms, okay, so not kind of following the rules of their gender, people, depending on the country you live in, might have a strong reaction to it. But do we have the same? Do we have the same reaction to people who don't follow economic rules, right? And so the only thing I can kind of think of is someone who, is very wealthy, but maybe, they live a very simple lifestyle, right? So they've got millions of dollars in the bank, and yet they dress in sort of the simplest, cheapest of clothes. They live in a very simple place. We would kind of expect someone with a huge amount of money to kind of live a certain lifestyle, right? To have fancy clothes and fancy houses and drive fancy cars. But if someone chooses not to do that, we may think it's strange, but we probably wouldn't have a strong reaction to it, would we? I don't know. I don't think we would. And people with a lot of money, I think, can act in all kinds of different ways, right? They can be very conspicuous with their wealth. They can, show it to everybody, or they can, live a very simple life and just keep their money sitting in the bank. But we don't seem to have a pretty strong reaction to it. Ben says, I think that's become more common nowadays. Other people who are watching, do you think what Ben is saying is true here? Do you think it's more common for people who have a lot of money to live a simpler lifestyle? And if so, like, why do you think that is? Why do you think it might be more common for people to live a simple life, even if they have lots of money? Do you think people's idea about wealth is changing, or people's ideas about wealth or income inequality? Do you think their ideas about that are changing? What do you think is kind of what do you think is happening there? If Ben is right, or if he's wrong, you can tell him that too. I'll just wait another second here for if somebody wants to chime in. But again, the point I'm making here is that some of our ideas about whatever inequality we're talking about in society, some of our ideas are cultural, right? Culture is supporting those inequalities, right? The things we believe to be true as part of our culture, right? And so, again, in lots of cases, Malika says, maybe after a while, another thing and more important than their style. It could be, right? And there are, that display of wealth, I think, varies culturally, right? So different cultures might think it's a good thing or a bad thing to kind of display your wealth. I also think there might be an age difference thing as well, right? Do you think that young people with lots of money are more likely to show off their wealth rather than old people with lots of money? I don't know. There's a cultural thing, or there's a cultural thing. There's a there's probably an age thing. Would you say there's a gender thing? Do you think men are more likely to show off their wealth than women are? I mean, I'm thinking of Ariana Grande and her Seven Rings video, but was that not typical for a woman to show off that wealth, whereas for men it is more typical, or I don't know. Well, yeah, Ben. Lots of things can go both ways, but you know, what's your perception, right? Is one more common than the other? You know, are things changing? Are things not changing? Why are they changing? Malika says, no, I don't think it's a gender thing, but it depends on the age. Okay. I think that's probably true. But again, you know, as we'll talk about a little later today, we're kind of relying on, you know, anecdotal evidence, right? We're kind of, I'm asking you these questions and, you know, without doing any research, we're kind of thinking about, you know, what we think to be true. And again, what we think to be true is not always correct, right? But yeah, I think I would agree with you there. Malika. Ben says here, I think young people showing off their wealth is more common than older people. I think that's probably true too. Again, we don't have any data to back this up, or at least I don't. You might. But yeah, that seems to be true to me as well, right? Young people who have money are more likely to, I think, display it than older people. And Mir's here. Good morning, Mir. Sorry, I don't know how to bring that discussion back to this, but yeah, oppression is cultural, right? So again, the cultural norms that we have tend to privilege the dominant group and disadvantage the minoritized group. Oh yeah, and Ben says, especially nowadays with social media. Yeah, that's true, right? Social media, particularly like Instagram, is great for displaying your kind of quality of life or your standard of living, right? And lots of people go to great lengths, I think, to, you know, portray their lives a certain way on Instagram, and whether it is or isn't that way is another question. But yeah, the Instagram is a way to kind of show off your life, right, in whatever way you want to. Yeah, so oppression is cultural, and we talked about this really quickly on Friday. The idea that you know, when Hillary Clinton ran for president, she had a difficult time because the norms of our society, or the norms of American society, kind of, you know, the way that we have thought about the job of President of the United States is very masculine, right? So the President of the United States is the commander-in-chief, right? He's the military leader. He's the strong, you know, clear-headed, tough leader that a proud, freedom-loving country needs, right? And a lot of those ideas we associate with masculinity and with being a man, right? The toughness, the logic, the bravery, the head of the military, which the president is. All of those things, you know, we associate with men, with masculinity. And so for someone like Hillary Clinton to win, or to even run for president, we said she had to do two things, right? She had to perform in a masculine way enough to convince people that she could be president, but being a woman, she also had to perform some kind of version of being a woman, right? She had to be feminine in some ways. But I think we talked about this on Friday, and that's a difficult line to walk, right? For her to be, you know, she can't be, you know, it says something about society, I think, when Hillary Clinton can't run for president and just sort of be a woman, right? That she has to adopt some male characteristics as well, right? And I think that was true of her, and probably of any woman in power, right? They often have to, adopt some more masculine traits in order to be taken seriously, right? And again, I'm not saying that that's a good thing or that it should be that way, but I think often that's the case. The other thing I'll point out very quickly here, and this is new from Friday, the idea that the story of women gaining the right to vote also has something to do with social hierarchies, right, or social stratification. So here we see that, yes, women gained the right to vote in 1918 or 1920 in Canada. Yes, that happened, but that didn't happen all the way across the social spectrum, right? The video pointed out that really what you were seeing was white European women were given the right to vote in 1918 or 1920, and for women of color and for Indigenous women, that fight continued, right, for quite some time. You can see here, again, in Canada, Indigenous people were not able to vote in Canada until the 1960s, right? And so that's pretty shocking, right? In light of some of the things we're hearing about Indian residential schools in the media currently, those Indigenous people had to send their children to school, and they didn't even have the right to vote, right? They couldn't even vote for someone who might do a better job for them. They weren't allowed to have a say. Here you can see in the US, black women did not have full access to vote until 1965, right? That's shocking, right? And decades after white women were able to vote. So, this is the story of gender inequality, but there is a racial thing that kind of intersects that, right? So people's racial identity had something to do with their ability to vote as well. So these suffragists, these women who are fighting for the right to vote, they had privilege, right? As white women, they had a certain amount of privilege in society, and even though, for a long time they were denied the right to vote, they had an easier time fighting for it than women of color would have, or Indigenous women, or Indigenous people in general. But again, often they're held up as representing all women, right? So the story we tell is that women were given the right to vote in 1918. And again, not quite, right? Only some women were given that right. Okay, so let me throw some numbers at you here. So again, if we're talking about the idea of women being able to participate in the political sphere, right? So women being able to vote, women being able to run for office. And so even though some of those changes happened in 1918 or 1920, and then of course later for people of color and Indigenous people, women are still underrepresented in most government positions. So here you can see that if you go to the US, if you go to Congress or the House of Representatives, whatever you want to call it, or if you go to the Senate, only 19% of those members are women. Right? And again, compare that to greater society where there's about 50% of Americans are women, give or take, right? And yet only 19% of their government representatives are women, right? On the Supreme Court, there's only 33% are women, right? So there's 9 judges, but only 3 are women. Only 18% of city mayors are women. Only 8% of governors are women. And again, there's never been a female president in the United States, right? So again, you're looking at half of the population of the United States is pretty significantly underrepresented in government, right? You would think that all things being equal, or if all things were equal, you might see, half, right? Half of the House and Senate seats being women, half of Supreme Court seats being women, maybe even half of presidents being women. But we don't see that, right? We see a pretty big underrepresentation. I'll talk a little bit about underrepresentation in a bit. The same thing, good morning, Daniel. The same thing is true of Canada, right? So in Canada, women make up 52% of our population. And even though in 2015 Justin Trudeau promised to and did appoint a 50-50 gender balanced cabinet. If you don't know what a cabinet is, those are kind of all of his like head ministers, right? So the people who are in charge of all the government ministries, he kind of chooses them from people who are elected. And so he promised he would choose half women and half men, which he did. But if you look at the government as a whole, again, you'll see that only 26% of federal representatives are women, right? And so many of the little committees that meet as part of federal government working, they don't have a woman on the committee, right? Because there's just not enough women in government. And again, you see a similar pattern here. 28% of city councilors are women. Only 18% of Canadian mayors are women. Good morning, Victoria. So again, pretty significantly underrepresented, right? And if you talk to the UN feels that at least 30% of the government needs to be composed of women before those women have a meaningful voice. So if you look at the US and Canada, basically what the UN is saying is that, even though we've kind of come a long way in terms of equality between men and women here in the US and Canada, even though we've come a long way, women don't have a meaningful voice in government, right? The UN is saying there's just not enough of them to legitimately create change, right? They're there, but there's just not enough of them to make, a significant difference. And again, I think that should be, here in Canada and the US, we should think about that, right? Because if you look at a list of people, if you look at a list of countries based on how many women are involved in government, you'll see that Canada and the US are pretty far down the line, right? I think most people in Canada and the US would say, we've got lots of equality here in Canada and the US, and levels of sexism are low. I think that would be their perception, right? Their idea of their own country. But the stats say that the US and Canada are 62nd and 104th in terms of women's representation in government. And yeah, here, as Nicole points out, Rwanda has 64% of women in parliament, which is fantastic, right? That's great. But it's also interesting because it's probably not something that most people living in Western countries, that's probably not what they would suspect. If they didn't see the list ahead of time, most people would not put Rwanda at the top, right? And so that's great for Rwanda. But you can see here the other countries who are kind of in the top, I think they're in the top 10. Some of those countries are countries that, again, people living in Western countries would be surprised about, right? So, seeing countries like Algeria and Afghanistan, and maybe even Spain and Argentina, having more women in government than Canada, I think a lot of Canadians would be surprised by that. And so, again, here in Canada, we think we're doing really well in terms of gender equality, but this set of statistics tells us that maybe not so much, right? Maybe women don't really have a meaningful voice in government, and we should be concerned about that, I think. Yeah, so again, even though King is here, good morning, King. There you are. Pardon me. So even though women are, again, the majority in the US and Canada, they still do not hold institutional power, right? And again, that's important, right? Power in society is not necessarily about numbers, right? It's not necessarily about who has more people. It's about who controls social institutions, right? A perfect example of this is South Africa, right? If you know anything about the history of South Africa and apartheid, you'll know that white people had the power in South Africa, and historically speaking, but they weren't the majority, right? They were a small minority. Most South Africaners were black, right? But the power was not held by them. And so here in Canada and the US, even though women are, at least half of the population or maybe more, they may actually be in the majority, they still don't have institutional power. And so the institutional power is that's what makes the difference. Okay, it's not just about numbers. Okay, right. So we on Friday we were supposed to read this article, but if you'll remember, I did a silly thing and I tried to add it to Microsoft Teams and it didn't add, and then I left the room and I thought you were reading it, but of course you weren't reading it because it didn't upload. And it was a big embarrassing thing. And so what I would like to do is just give you a little bit of time to read that right now. Okay, so it's a very short thing. It's probably, it'll probably take you less than 10 minutes to do. And so what I think I'll do is I'll put some time on the clock here, and I'll direct you to Microsoft Teams because it is there now. Thank God. A short little reading called "What Makes Sexism Difficult to See." And so I want you to identify those three major things. Okay. What three things make sexism difficult to see? The ideology of the civilized versus the uncivilized world, and then what does it mean to position women's oppression as an issue of marginalized societies? Okay, so the little reading will talk about these three things. Okay, and then I'll ask you the question of, did that BBC documentary we watched with the four young women, did that documentary do that? Which is a bit tricky. So I'll give you some time. I'm gonna mute myself here, and I'm just gonna turn my fan on because it's rapidly getting warm in here. So I'll let you read this. I'm going to put, let me see. I'm going to put 11 minutes on the clock. That's probably a long time for this, but I want you to type out some answers as well, because I want you to kind of copy and paste those answers into the live chat. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of extra time in order to actually type out some answers, because I do want to see them in the live chat, because obviously you can't just shout them out here. Okay, so I'll put 11 minutes on the clock, read the article in Microsoft Teams, answer the questions and type them out so that you can put them in the live chat. And I'm just going to turn on my fan for a few minutes and cool off. Okay, so let's do that. So that about does it for the timer. I hope that was enough time for everyone to read through it. Again, it's a short one, but it's I understand that the way the language and the way that it's written may be a little bit advanced, but hopefully we can pull what we need out of this. So the first question I'm asking you here are three major things that make sexism difficult to see. And Ben's kind of jumped in here and added some things in, so I'm just going to look at them. The first thing, the way dominant culture focuses on the individual obscures group level patterns. Yeah. And so we've talked about that a little bit before too, right? The idea that, individual examples of things or our personal experience with things don't often tell us the whole story. Right? They don't often tell us what's going on in society. And so, people's prejudices are often kind of built on this, right? So, let's go back to the dog example, right? We talked about the idea where, there are lots of stereotypical ideas about what dogs are like, right? Some of those stereotypes are good, some of them are bad. People have prejudicial ideas towards dogs, sometimes, good prejudices, as in they like them, sometimes negative prejudices, like they don't. And then people will discriminate against dogs either positively or negatively, right? So people who have positive prejudices towards dogs will, welcome those dogs, right? And sort of talk about them in a positive manner. People with negative prejudices towards dogs will try to avoid dogs, right? Or keep them away from themselves. And so damn it, I'm not sure where I was going with that. Dominant culture focuses on individuals. Right. So those prejudicial ideas that we have. So if we talked about this in class, and I think most people had kind of positive prejudices towards dogs, but a few people had negative ones. But whatever kind of prejudice you hold about dogs, whether it's positive or negative, doesn't really say anything about the way most dogs are, right? So we don't really have any data about this is kind of funny. Every time you meet a dog, you say, who's a good dog? We don't have any data about how many good dogs there are, right, versus how many bad dogs. But your prejudice, your ideas about what dogs are like, will kind of inform your experiences with dogs. And so, if you have negative prejudices towards dogs, you will, again, be more likely to remember negative interactions with those animals. If you have a positive prejudice, you're more likely to remember positive interactions with those animals. But whatever your experience and whatever your prejudice, it doesn't really reflect, the ratio of good dogs to bad dogs out there, right? We don't have that data. We don't really know, how many dogs are good and how many dogs are bad, right? But again, your personal experience will lead you to believe that, dogs are bad or dogs are good. I don't know if that makes any sense or not. I almost got lost in the explanation there. But Ben, you're very right. Dominant culture often focuses on individual acts. Here's kind of an example here. So this is a horrific story here. I believe this is from 2020. This woman was raped and murdered in Britain, in the UK. And so again, when we think of sexism or when we think of racism, we often think about the big events, right? And so for racism, the murder of George Floyd was sort of a catalyst, right? It was a very important event that was kind of explosive in terms of American history and in terms of what was happening in terms of discussions of racism and Black Lives Matter movement. And then the murder of George Floyd was very big and very newsworthy. But focusing on just those big incidences like the murder of this poor woman here, or the murder of George Floyd. Again, it doesn't really, it distracts us from seeing how racism or how sexism operates in society as a whole, right? Come back to that in a second. The second one here, I'm going to, so Rafay says here, through advertising or school or curriculums, sexism is held in place, right? And Ben's going to add in here corporate produced pop culture, right? So the idea here is that we are being sold sexism, right? Through our, through music video, through advertising, through movies, through television. All of these things are kind of working to, I guess, create a very narrow version of what gender actually is. And it's probably worth pointing out here, pardon me, it's probably worth pointing out here that I think things are changing a little bit in popular media. So particularly on streaming platforms like Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever you have, we're kind of seeing stories and characters that move away from, you know, the most traditional expressions of masculinity and femininity, right? So we're seeing different kinds of characters. But up until recently, I think we were seeing a lot of stereotypes, right? And again, if you remember back in this class when we were looking at the pictures of all those toys, right? The girl toys and the boy toys, you know, a lot of those very simple messages and stereotypes about gender are still being transmitted to young people. And again, it's very difficult to not believe those ideas are natural or real when they come at you from every direction, right? When you see them in movies, when you see them in television, see them in advertising, maybe you see your parents kind of acting them out at home, you see toys that send you the same messages. You know, the more you see it and the more those ideas are kind of shown to you, the more realistic they become, right? And so here we see sexist ideas are kind of packaged and sold to us, right? And then the third thing that makes sexism difficult to see here, Ben's thrown in, it's obscured by the ideology of being civilized and liberated. Okay, so Ben's got a follow-up here. He says, civilized versus uncivilized spoken about in the text somewhat says the civilized woman has more freedom in the sense of wearing what they want. Yeah, that's kind of, well, yes and no. Fashion is a part of it. But what's going on here is that I think the West likes to see itself as civilized, right? As progressive, as liberal. Western society, and I think this is probably true of all societies, Western society likes to think that the way we do things is the right way, okay? And again, I think that's common to all cultures. All cultures think that they're doing things the correct way, right? The way that it should be. And this is certainly true of the West. And so what's kind of happening here is that because the West sees itself as liberal and progressive, I think it's more likely to see itself as not sexist and more likely to see other countries as sexist, right? And particularly this has to do with how women dress, right? And so this is kind of getting into, well, how should we talk about this? This is difficult to talk about through the internet with just messaging, but I'll kind of do my best here. The textbook points out this idea of civilized versus uncivilized, and they have a little, a short list of kind of binary opposites, right? So there's a list of, let's see, 7 things, I think. And so they're contrasting modern versus primitive, right? They're contrasting active versus passive, individual versus group, industrious versus idle, right? Open versus covered. And again, we see these binary opposites, right? People trying to, create two categories and then put people into one or the other, right? And so here we see that Western society is trying to imagine itself as all of these things on the left, right? As modern and active and industrious and free and open, right? And countries with maybe more restrictive roles of women are seen as things on the right. And so, sorry, I'm just going to read this here. And so these things are not entirely true, right? Most binary opposites are kind of either just inaccurate or they're oversimplifications, and this one is too. And King here adds in, social positions such as race and class also determines a woman's experience under sexism. And so these binaries reinforce racism, classism, religious oppression, and other types of oppression as well. So here, what's, the long and short of what's happening here in this third piece, I'm just going to put that back up, is just that, is that the West likes to see itself as progressive and civilized and free, and so it's easier for them to look at other countries where maybe there's greater inequality between men and women, and it's easier for them to look at those countries and say, oh gosh, look at that, look what's happening in Saudi Arabia, I don't know, for example. Look at what's happening in Saudi Arabia, oh gosh, that's awful. Thank God we don't have sexism here, right? That's kind of what Western countries like to do. But that's not entirely true, right? So you may have sexism in Saudi Arabia, and in fact, I'm fairly certain that you do. But that doesn't mean that you don't have it at home either, right? Maybe you have less inequality. Maybe you have inequality that is maybe more visible in Saudi Arabia than it is in your own country. Or maybe it's easier to look at a different culture or a different country and not understand the things that you see, right? And so, when you're in your own culture, when you're in your own country, you understand the meanings of things. You understand, what society's kind of symbols are, and so looking at a different culture, it's very easy to kind of misunderstand or, kind of wrongly understand what's going on. And so I'm not sure. I think I'm kind of muddying the waters here, but this is basically the number 3 is basically the process of the West looking at other countries and saying, oh gosh, look at that sexism there. That's really horrible. That's what sexism looks like. Thank God we don't have it here, right? And so again, you may not have, that particular restriction or that particular way of dressing or whatever it is, but it doesn't mean there's not sexism happening in Western society, because there absolutely is. The third question that I wanted to ask you here, which might be a little tricky, is the idea of positioning women's oppression as an issue of marginalized societies. So this is related to, actually I should put this back on the screen. This is related to this third point, right? So this is related to, sexism is something that happens in developing countries, or that happens in kind of non-G7 countries, right? But here in the West, we don't have that. It's related to that kind of perception or that kind of idea. Do you think that documentary, the BBC documentary with Ross, whatever his name was, do you think they did that? Do you think that they tried to make women's oppression an issue of maybe non-Western societies? Or do you think that they did not do that? Or are you totally confused? Because if you are, you can say you're totally confused, and that's valid. chiming in yet? Are you all just hot and exhausted and you need a break? Is that what's happening here? Okay, let me just look at my slides here. Oh yeah, okay. Okay, let's take a little break, guys, because it is hot and I need to turn my fan on here again. So let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back. We'll just tie up number 3 here, and then I'll show you some other stuff. Okay, so 10-minute break. We'll see you. Get something cool to drink and stand in front of a fan. We'll see you in a minute. Okay. Okay, and we're back. It was really tough to shut off that fan, though, I've got to tell you. So let's just see here. Let's just see here. Okay, so so okay. So the last question I had asked you, I think, was the idea of positioning women's oppression as an issue of marginalized societies. And so right before the break, Kang kind of asked me to repeat that. And so that's the question I'm asking you. And in other words, did that documentary try to make sexism, you know, something that just happens in non-Western countries? Do you think it was kind of guilty of that in any way, or not so much? Again, that's a tricky question, but since it comes up in this reading, I'm curious to know what you think. So did the documentary try to position women's oppression or sexism against women as a problem of non-Western societies? I ask you guys all the tough questions, don't I? What do you think? Any idea? If you don't know, it's okay to type I don't know either. Like that's you can do that. Well, maybe nobody will type anything. Oh, there we go. Some Pence has no idea. Okay, that's that's fair. It's a tough question. It's a tough question. Any other any thoughts? Any other thoughts? I know Ben's kind of struggling with this one, and that's okay. Um, you know, the questions that you struggle with are the best ones. So maybe it's a question worth asking. But any other thoughts? We can just move on from this if you want, but maybe I'll just give another second or two just to see if anyone else wants to suggest something. If not, I'll move on. Okay, I'll move on. So, oh, that's my. Okay, so all right, let's leave that for now. So the questions here: what makes sexism difficult to see? So um, as has been pointed out here, mainstream culture often positions oppression as a problem of marginalized societies. Again, there's a focus on individual instances rather than group level patterns. And corporate culture often amplifies our stereotypical gender roles, right? They often show us, the stereotypes that we already have rather than kind of challenging them, right? So again, I showed you you see news stories like this. Whoops. See news stories like this, and again, this is a horrible act. Violence against women is much more common, of course, than violence against men, and so we should we should pay attention to this, right? Absolutely, but again, it's not on its own. It's not proof of sexism, right? And so, yes, we should pay attention to stories like this, but we should also look for the broader kind of group dynamics, and I'll show you that in just a second. Okay. Um, Again, corporate culture and advertising and media often sells us the same kind of um, sexist stereotypes that we've always grown up with, right? So here, we see toys that are, transmitting messages to young boys about dominance and violence and physical strength, power over others. And those are the same messages that I think boys have been given for decades, right? through their toys, through their playthings. And again, girls are continually given the same messages about appearance and about the need to look pretty, but also about domestic duties, right? So looking after babies, doing the cooking and the cleaning, those things kind of show up in, maybe not so much the cleaning, but the cooking. Those things show up in girls' toys. And again, we give girls the same messages over and over for decades, right? Here you can see some pretty clear sexism in advertising, right? So maybe I'll ask you this here. Here's two ads, right? One is for some sort of protein drink, I guess, or energy drink. What's it called? Maxi Milk. Yeah, so some kind of milk-based protein beverage or something. And then there's on the right, you can see an ad for Under Armour, I think. I think it's Under Armour. So help me out here. What kind of messages are these two ads transmitting about men? What are men like according to these two ads? So throw that into the live chat for me. What are we meant to understand about men by looking at these two ads? What's the message? Okay, so Ben says yes. So strength, right? Yeah, I think we see that in both of these. Give me more. Yeah, strength and it's muscular strength, right? It's physical strength, right? Look at these guys have muscles, right? Big pecs. Look at that. That dude has an 8-pack. Jeez. Um, yeah, so we see evidence of like physical strength, of muscularity, right? The Under Armour one is kind of like, yeah, wear Under Armour and get the ladies, right? So you can see this, attractive woman in bed behind him, right? The message is pretty clear, I think, right? Um, yeah. First one says real men should have 6 packs and be in shape. Yeah, that guy is in super good shape, right? Um, what else? What other messages are kind of coming through in terms of what men are like? And again, you may have to be a little bit creative, but I think the messages are here, right? So the strength is definitely part of it, right? Because both of these guys are muscular, in shape kind of guys. Um, there's definitely something about relationships to women in the Under Armour ad. What else do you see here about what men are like? What else do you see here about what men are like? Hmm. Give you a few more seconds there. They're studs. Define studs for me, Ben. Define studs, because I think there's what is a stud? What does it mean to be one? I think that's coming through in these ads as well. What does it mean to be a stud, or what is it about what these men are doing that we would recognize as masculine? Let's see here. Oh, okay. So Sean says something about masculine and capable, right? So I guess Sean's probably referring to the milk guy, right? He's capable, right? Look at this rock climber. He's hanging off the edge of a cliff. Seems very capable of climbing this mountain, right? Good looking, well built, dangerous, right? Yeah, there's there's a couple things. Yeah, like the milk guy is doing something super dangerous, right? He's hanging off a cliff by just like one hand, right? But does he look worried? No, right? He's all cool. He's so relaxed, in fact, that he's gonna he's gonna have a drink of milk, right? When most of us would probably be, hanging on for dear life and, fearing we're gonna slip. He's all cool, right? He's in a dangerous situation, but he's so relaxed, he's just gonna have a drink of his maxi milk or whatever it is, right? Um, yeah, we see this kind of intense, smoldering gaze, right, from the guy with the Under Armour guy. Uh, the other thing, I don't know if you would agree with me on this, and you can disagree, but the idea that, this the Under Armour guy has obviously, just slept with this woman, right? And he's kind of walking away from the bed, and he seems like totally unaffected, right? Like he can sort of be intimate with this woman and then just walk away and say, okay, now I'm off to do my manly things, right? It's like there's no attachment between them, right? Like if you imagine that these two just, slept together, if you imagine they're just intimate, they're not cuddling, they're not, hanging out, talking in bed or anything. He's like, he's out of there, right? Um, and again, maybe I'm going too far. Am I going too far with that, do you think? Do you think that's too much of a, do you think I'm reading too much into that? Sometimes it's tempting to think that you are, right? Sometimes it's tempting to think that you're overthinking something. But the other thing to remember about advertisements is that everything is there for a reason, right? These ads are very carefully designed. And so if you see something in an ad, it's probably there on purpose. But let's see. So, okay, so Malika agrees. Ben saying nah. Nah seems accurate. Okay. Simran, no. Okay. Well, and it's, again, it's tough to know for sure, right? It's tough to know what message this is meant to transmit or to convey. But it's also worth thinking about it doesn't really matter what it's meant to convey. What matters is what the message people receive, right? So again, if you think that that message is being transmitted by this ad, then it is, right? It's coming through. People are absorbing it, whether Under Armour meant to say that particular thing or not, right? Let's have a look at, yeah, here's another one, right? Um, this was from The Guardian, but it's an ad for some sort of dieting product, meal replacement and supplement. So I guess if you sign up with this company, you'll get some sort of, I don't know, diet powder or smoothie powder or something, and that will make your body beach ready. So again, I'll ask you the same question. I know we've only got a few minutes left here. What messages are we receiving from this ad about women? What messages are we receiving about women here? Okay, so Ben says that the type of body women should have. Yeah, so the question in the ad is, are you beach body ready? And so I assume the answer is that this woman is, right? And so yeah, there's a message of this is an ideal female body, right? There's that message there. What other messages are mixed in here? What other what other things are? what's this ad telling us about women or about society and women? I think Ben is correct. I think Ben is correct by saying this, but I think there's maybe a little more to it. Uh, you have to wear a bathing suit at the beach. Um, that's true. That's true. Um, Simran says they're trying to show how a woman should look. Could be related to body shaming. Yeah, I think that's probably true as well. Um, I'll give you another second and then maybe I'll add something into the mix. Could be related to body shaming. So when we talk about body shaming or when we talk about fat shaming, we're basically, that's the idea that, some bodies are acceptable and some are not, right? And I think Ben's saying here you have to wear a bathing suit. Yes, you often do, right? And we've also said that this is what a woman should look like, right? So do you think that it would be going too far to say that, if you're going to go to the beach, you have to make sure that your body is, what's the word I'm looking for? Acceptable or desirable to other people. And if it's not, then you shouldn't be showing it, right? So do you think there's kind of an underlying message that not only that this is ideally how women should look, but if you don't look this way, then you shouldn't be going to the beach, right? Or somehow your body is not acceptable, not desirable, shouldn't be seen. Um, you know that there's something wrong, right? You need this product in order to go to the beach. Um, yeah, maybe it says going to the beach, you need a good body and you need to be in shape, right? Which of course is not true, right? Anyone can go to a beach looking any way they want, right? But yeah, this one says that, it almost it almost says that you're not allowed, right? You're not allowed there unless you look like this. And if you don't look like this, then you need to buy this product so that you will look like this. Spoiler alert, that product will not allow you to look like that. I'm sorry. Um, but yeah, there's some complicated messages under the surface, I think, here. And again, Kang says it depends on individual opinion. Yeah, I mean, people are going to, see bodies differently, and people are going to interpret ads differently. But again, it's worth asking the question about what are people getting from this, right? What message are people getting? Okay, I'm going to stop it right there because we're at 9:40. I actually meant to end a little bit early, but that didn't really happen. Rafe says it shows you what the ideal body is if you want to go to the beach with confidence. Yeah, right. And so, but again, ask yourself the question, why can people who don't look like this, why can they not go to the beach with any confidence? Because most people don't look like that, right? She's a model, right? She probably spends all of her time working on her body and paying attention to her diet. Her job is to, well, there's some genetics involved, but her job is to look that way. And so, most people do not look like she does. And so, can they all not go to the beach? It seems unfair. Um, anyway, yeah, but we'll come back to this tomorrow. That was a good, those are all good comments, and I'd like to just pick this up tomorrow. But as I say, we're out of time. So everybody, please stay cool, stay hydrated today. Um, you know, yeah, stay cool however you can. Have a cold shower. Cold showers are great. Um, get in front of a fan. I'm going to turn my fan on in a minute here. But thanks for joining today, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Okay, so, or I'll see some of you in 20 minutes, but see you shortly or see you tomorrow. Bye. Good work today.